In this tutorial, I'll be going through the curve fade animation node. So the curve fade node allows you to add changing parameters of any of the numerical properties within your material, and it does so over a specified period of time. So I'm going to be changing the opacity of a material, and we're also going to be changing the bump map slightly. So as you can see here, I've got an animation here of 6 seconds long. If I play through it, should be able to sort of see it's comprised of 3 shots and of 2 seconds each. And the material we've got at the moment is just an interior diffuse white. So if I open up the material graph, you can see we've got the parent node and a diffuse node. So if I right click on the background, we can go down to animation, and we have 2 options here, the color fade and the curve fade. So I'm going to choose the curve fade, double click there, and we have 2 different drop down sections here. So we have the animation time settings, where we have the start, the end, and therefore the duration. And as you can see, our animation is currently just going for a duration of 1 second between the start of the animation, so 0 seconds, and 1 second in. If I open up the animation drop down, we've got the graph here with a green line and 2 keyframes at the beginning and end, one at the 1 second point and one at the 0 second point. You'll be familiar with this type of graph if you've ever played with the custom motion ease in and out stuff with any of the other animation tools. If not, you can see those square points are handles for each keyframe. So you can manipulate the shape of the graph just by pulling and dragging these around. So the way I've got it set up at the moment is it's going to ease into the motion or ease into the change of parameter. And then once it gets around this mark here where my mouse is, it's going to then ease out and slow down. If you don't want to have the handles, you can switch to linear interpolation up here, and that will get rid of them, and you'll have a straight line from point A to point B. We have constant value as well, so if I click on this one, then you'll see that we can go value of 0 from 0 seconds, and then at the 1 second mark, then we're going to snap to a value of 1. The buttons to the right are to control whether or not we have the handles, and for this one, we're just going to keep it simple and have it as linear. So what we're going to be changing, we're going to have a base layer, and we're going to have our final material applied as a label. So our base layer, which is going to be visible at the beginning and slowly disappear, is going to be a wireframe down at the bottom there. And you'll see our diffuse has been replaced by that wireframe. So I'm going to change blue to black, and I might change the width as well, just decrease that. So now we have our base layer. I'm going to right click in the background again, go to not texture, we want to go to materials and plastic, and I'm going to plug the plastic into label. And you can see now our wireframe has completely disappeared because it's underneath that plastic label, which is covering the entire bit of 3D geometry. So if I apply the curve fade to opacity of the plastic, you'll notice that we immediately go back to the wireframe. That's because our animation at the moment, indicated by that blue line there, or if I go into the curve fade, this blue line here, is at the 0 mark, and our keyframe, our first keyframe at the 0 second mark is at a value of 0. So therefore our plastic is completely transparent. Now if I drag it over to the 1 second mark, you'll notice that our opacity is now at 1 and our plastic is now opaque, so you can see it fully. So we can have this go over the course of the entire animation. So if I change the keyframe, the second keyframe, to be a time of 6 seconds, we can zoom out to see where it is, or there's this button in the top right, zoom to fit, and that will just fit our entire green line in there. So you can see now 0 seconds bottom left, 6 seconds in the bottom right. And if I drag across, it's just going to take longer for that plastic to appear. But we can make this more interesting. So if I right click add in a procedural texture, which is going to be spots. And I plug our curve fade into the radius of our spots and our spots into the opacity of our plastic. Now we're going to be, if I move it slightly along, you'll see those spots are uncovering that wireframe underneath. And because we're changing the radius from a value of 0 to 1, then the radius of those spots is getting bigger and bigger, and we're uncovering the layer beneath. So this is the opposite way around. We want to start with the wireframe first. And as you can see, once we get to the 1 second mark, at the 6 second mark, our value of 1 isn't quite enough to cover the entire geometry either. So we can change the first keyframe to have a value of 3 and our last keyframe to have a value of 0. Now you'll see by the end we're going to have a fully formed product. I do zoom to fit, and at the beginning we're going to have a completely uncovered wireframe. So I'm going to clean up my nodes by pressing the Align Nodes in Work Area button, and let's see if we can make that more interesting still. So if I right click in the background and go back down to Animation Curve Fade, I can plug this into the spots again, and I'm plugging into the plus sign at the bottom of these 4 options. And that's going to bring up all the parameters that are changeable. So I will go to the fall off, and what we want to do, as you can see there, is soften those edges, and we want to be able to control that as well. So we want the edges to be soft at the very beginning, and by the end we don't want to have any sort of slight gaps or any gradients of sort of differing transparency. So we want the fall off to be a value of 0 at the beginning and a value of 3 at the end. And I'm going to change that to linear interpolation as well. So I'll zoom to fit, and you may notice that we are starting at a time of 2 seconds and 125 milliseconds and finishing 1 second later. So that's because I am currently at that 2 second and 125 millisecond mark. So wherever I am in the animation timeline, when I placed my curve fade node into our material graph, that's where it's going to start. So make sure you just bring that back to 0, and it's not going to be able to surpass our first node, so I need to change my first node to 0 and 0 milliseconds. Change our second node to the 6 second mark, no milliseconds, and a value of 3. Zoom to fit so I can see the whole graph. And now if I scroll to the end, you'll be able to see those spots with a bit of a soft edge as they haven't fully formed, but by the end you'll see that plastic is fully visible. And finally, the last thing I wanted to do was add a bump map. So let's scroll right to the end, right click, textures, and noise texture. I've scrolled to the end as well so that I can see our plastic. If I'm changing our plastic at the beginning here, then I'm not going to be able to see what I'm doing. So if I go to the end, I want to plug my noise texture into the bump of our plastic label. And I'm going to reduce the scale down to 1. And I want the bump height to be 0.4. So we can animate this. So if I go to animation and curve fade, plug that into the noise texture, we've got 4 options and I want the bump height. So I'm going to go to curve fade, animation, and you can see in the time settings as well, I started at 6 seconds, so it's going from 6 seconds to 7 seconds. I want it to just take place in the last sort of section, so I'll go start for 4 seconds and I'll set the duration for 2 seconds, so we end at that 6 second mark where everything else ends. And we are currently, I'm going to turn the handles off, we're currently going from a value of 0 to a value of 1, and we previously set our bump height to 0.4, so I'm going to make our final value 0.4, and now you can see we're back to that texture that we previously made. If I scroll to the beginning of the 4-second mark, you can see our plastic texture doesn't have that noise. It's pretty fully reflective. As I go through, bottom texture is appearing, and by the end, it's fully formed. The last thing that we need to do is change these dials and other materials as well. So we could go in there and do exactly the same, but we want the settings to be exactly the same. Everything should stay the same so that it's all uniform. So I'm going to hold Control and click on our 2 curve fades and these spots. I can right click and copy selection or Control C. And now I have my materials here. There's only 4 of them and we've changed one already. So I'll go into Chrome, open the material graph. I'm going to change our metal to label. And I'm going to go into materials and add a wireframe. Just like we have with the other material, the main body material. So I'll change settings to be the same. And you won't be able to see, you'll just see the chrome at the moment because we haven't added our nodes in. So we can paste, Control V or right click and paste. Now I'm going to zoom out so we can see those nodes. And I just need to plug in those spots into the opacity of our label. And you'll see there that chrome's disappeared. I can move it ahead. And just check, yep, our chrome's coming through there. And let me double click on our curve fades, starting at 0 seconds, ending at 6 seconds. All looking good. So I can close that material graph. Go to the glass, open up material graph. Now we want to see the dial underneath, so we're not too fussed about changing our glass to a wireframe. Let's just paste and plug in our curve face into the opacity of that glass. So it just appears over time by the end. Cancel that material graph, and finally our label with the dial. So this is a similar layout. We've already got the label attached. We want to change our diffuse to wireframe. Let's put in the same numbers. This is copy and pastable as well, but since it's a simple material, I'm just going to do it manually. And I'll right click, paste our spots in there, and plug that into the opacity of the material of our label. And now you can see we've got a wireframe. Scroll through and that dial's coming through there. And it should be fully formed by this point as well. Let's align nodes just to make sure everything's looking good. Let's go into curve fade, 0 seconds to 6, 0 to 6. All looking good. And that is how to use the curve fade node. So it's a simple tool, but considering that you can plug it into almost any parameter of almost any material, you can really get creative with it and start to do something like these product reveals that I've just shown you how to do today. So if you've got any questions, then please feel free to leave a comment and I'll get back to you as soon as I can.